Hello, welcome to the MEA podcast. Today I'm going to be talking to John Coyle. John is an author, an Olympic athlete, and a teacher, and has spent the last few days down here in Baja together with us, sharing some of his thinking about the relationship between our strengths and weaknesses, and the way we might need to think about them as we move forward in our career. He'll also talk to us about the best ways to metabolize stress, and lastly, some of the research that he's been doing on chronoception, or how we perceive time, especially as we age, and how that perception of time can be extended if we are conscious about it. So John, welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking some time out to speak to us about your work.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. First of all, before we kind of jump into the content of your work, there seem to be sort of two seminal ideas or experiences that underpin most of your work. One was your career as a professional athlete, and one was your experience in sort of the heart of the design thinking movement. Can you tell us a little bit about those two experiences, and then we'll move into some of your work?
Sure. So I was fortunate while at Stanford, which I barely got into, to stumble into having as my academic advisor a man named David Kelley, not the movie producer, but the David Kelley that's also famous for founding Stanford's D School, IDEO, the consulting firm, and being Steve Jobs' key designer for a good 20 years and a great friend. So I was sort of thrust into this world of design thinking, and for those who aren't familiar, the simple version of that is it's a way of thinking about solving complex problems by making sure you're framing them right, making sure you have the question right, and making sure you have empathy involved in the process. Mm-hmm. So I was fortunate to have that in my background, and I used that actually to hack the sport of speed skating. So I was graduating from Stanford, and I was still speed skating at that time in my life, and struggling with the Olympic team because they were incessantly focused on having me train a certain way that didn't seem to work for me. And using design thinking, I eventually figured out a new way to train, a new way to race, and ultimately ended up being able to go to the Olympics and bring home a medal at some point.
You say you use design thinking to hack speed skating. Can you sort of dive into that just a little bit, because the story is truly fascinating?
No, absolutely. I was training on my own for a number of years and doing what I knew best, which was just to do the kind of workouts I liked. Mm-hmm. And that worked okay. I ended up 12th place in the world while still full-time as a student. So when I graduated and finally was able to join the Olympic team full-time, I was expecting things to go very, very well, but they put me on a different path. They put me on a path of fixing my weaknesses, and because I am not an aerobic athlete, which most speed skaters are, I'm an anaerobic athlete. I have large amounts of power for short bursts, and so they put me on a path to try to make me an aerobic athlete, but that didn't work out, and I ended up not making the team 2 years later. And so I was sort of ready to quit, but I kept anchoring back to design thinking. Are we solving the right problem? Have we framed the challenge right? Do we really understand and have empathy, in this case for me? And the reality was no, I didn't and they didn't. I didn't have empathy for me either. But when I finally accepted I was not an aerobic athlete, which was a hard thing to muster up, that was the day that I could start actually training the right way for me. And instead of going farther, faster, which is what they were training me to do, I decided to go less far, less fast. And that was possible by shortening my course, taking a huge burst of power required to maneuver through these narrow corners in short track. And ultimately that led to setting multiple national records and even breaking the world record.
Mm-hmm. You talk about design thinking essentially as a way to help you ask a different type of question. And in your book, you explore this idea of asking a different type of question about how you get better at things, in terms of not designing for your weaknesses and not trying to mitigate your weaknesses, but designing for your strengths. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, one of the big insights that has emerged from thinking about this over the years is that strengths and weaknesses are usually the same thing, or at least facets of the same thing. Now, a lot of people kind of recognize that. If you're practical, you're probably critical. If you're detail-oriented, you're probably perfectionist. If you're big picture strategist, you're probably a bit sloppy about the details. If you're creative, you're probably disorganized. And I could go on and on. These things go hand in hand. If you're direct and honest, you're probably blunt and rude. However, the part that I think most people miss is when you try to fix a true weakness, not a skill gap, and all of those, by the way, are strengths and weaknesses, you actually run the risk and usually do destroy the corresponding strength. And there's a huge opportunity cost in the process. So if you're direct and honest and blunt and rude, and you try to fix being blunt and rude, you're probably no longer direct and honest. And so nobody's making good decisions because nobody's raising their hand to talk about maybe this idea doesn't have merit. And at the same time, you're spending all this time playing whack-a-mole with those weaknesses when you could just be doubling down on what you do best.
It's a pretty counterintuitive way of looking at the world, in as much as mostly we're taught to try and get good at everything.
Right.
And your own career was an illustration of the fact that actually by getting really good at the things you're good at, you were able to excel in a way that perhaps your overall profile wouldn't have allowed. Do people commonly accept what you're saying in that area?
It's interesting, as you say that. I think they get it both rationally at the time and also emotionally at the time when I speak. But the programming is so firmly entrenched since we were kids to never give up, never give in, never quit, quitters never prosper, good things come to those who wait, that there's this really hardcore wiring about I can't just focus on what I'm good at. I gotta get back to fixing weaknesses. But I heard a quote I can't attribute, but I think it's spot on, which is, what the world doesn't want from you is to get slightly better at what you're mediocre at. What the world wants for you is to get amazing at something you're already great at.
That is fantastic. You then have taken this sort of design thinking approach that you apply to racing your strengths to a variety of other areas. You talked to us as a group around this idea of a different approach or a different way of thinking about stress.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about that?
For sure. And just like the previous conversation topic, which was instead of how do I fix my weaknesses, which is a fine problem for kids, but I would argue is a terrible problem for adults, a better reframe of that question is how do I design for my strengths? When it comes to stress, I think that a better question than how do I minimize my stress or manage my stress or reduce my stress to perform better, a better question is how do I improve my performance under stress and greater stress and learn to like it. And that's actually totally possible.
Learn to like stress.
Yes.
Okay. Persuade me.
Well, this is where sports are such a great analogy. I love that sports are a great analogy because I happen to be a former athlete, or still, I guess. In sports, you take on stress intentionally, and you intentionally raise it and raise it and raise it. This is why you do more bicep curls, you put on more weight, you do more laps, you increase your speed. All of these things are intentionally taking on, in this case, physical stress. There's some emotional as well. You can do the same with psychological stress. You can learn to take on psychological stress, learn how to recover from it properly, and then double down on the same activity and actually learn to lean into the things that used to make you crazy. And one of the keys to that, straight out of sports again, is gamifying your stress. Mm-hmm. The primary difference between sports and business is that sports is a game and it's fun and it has stats, and the people that do it love it, and a lot of people in business that are stressed view it as a 1 or 0, no stats, no game, and then they're just totally overwhelmed in a world of cortisol, and that doesn't work.
But you also, there's a considerable amount of brain science behind this as well, right? It is literally biological function. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Yeah, it is straight out of brain science. We as mammals are wired to view threats in a certain lens. Up until about 200 years ago, all threats were basically life-threatening. You could die in the savannah, you could die without food, you could die from cold, die from heat, die. Life was a series of never-ending biological and environmental threats, and so your response was to emit cortisol and then either fight, run, or freeze, and that's perfectly adaptive when a lion's coming at you out of the jungle. It's just less adaptive in our modern society. You probably should do none of those things if you get a snarky email from a coworker. But unfortunately, our hard wiring is that we respond exactly those ways, and it's massively maladaptive. And the problem is they come like death of 1,000 paper cuts, it's death of 1,000 emails. You start to get stress, and then it overwhelms you, and you're emitting cortisol out of all your pores, and that will absolutely kill you. So yes, you can die from a death of 1,000 email cuts. However, if you can gamify your stress, your response mechanism switches. Once it's a game, then you emit DHEA and oxytocin, which causes your heart rate to go down, it causes health to improve, and actually causes you to ask for help. Way more adaptive.
And this is literally going on in different parts of the brain, right?
That's right. The frontal cortex loses control when the stress response from the back brain takes over, but you can regain control if you let your front brain take the reins of the situation and say, wait, what should I do here? What's the right way to respond? Do I choose this as 100-0, or do I say I have a 30% chance of this outcome and a 60% chance of this other outcome and a 10% of the other?
So you took this type of thinking and perhaps unexpectedly applied it to time. Tell us how that all strings together.
Yes, I know it's a bit of a leap, but I've been obsessed with time for a very long time, probably from being in sports where, the margins of victory in my sport were gold to silver, 2/100ths of a second, gold to 10th place, 33/100ths. I mean, it's just nonsense that entire lives and futures and trajectories can hinge on these tiny, tiny increments. But what I realized that was happening in real life, if sports isn't real, is the same thing happens in business, in personal lives, that tiny increments of time ultimately determine our futures and our trajectories. And if we're not present to see and avail ourselves of these new hinging opportunities, then we potentially miss the greatest changes that life has to offer us. And the Greeks actually had a term for this. They called it kairos. They had chronos time, which was clock time, but then they had kairos time, which was when everything happens at once, or the etymology is when the archer releases an arrow, everything happens at once and the trajectory is set. And we as humans experience this fairly regularly, but if we are not being present and mindful of what's happening in those moments, we miss them.
Give me an example of kairos time, both in your career and something that I might be able to personally relate to.
Sure. So, one of the probably the greatest kairos moments of my life happened after my first Olympics, and I was training for the next Olympics, and sadly I failed to make the team, and I was so disillusioned and disappointed that I separated myself from the sport for more than a decade, and I wasn't going to ever have anything to do with it, and I certainly didn't talk about it. But I was invited to be the analyst for NBC at the Olympics, and while I was there, a parent pulled me aside and created a kairos moment that has changed the entire trajectory of my life ever since. He let me know that 10 years prior, I had met his son at a little event. He was 11 years old, and that when I put my medal around his son's neck, his son had decided to pursue the sport, which he had never done before, and that the following day he was in the gold medal round at the Olympics, and that just blew my mind. Every single part of my life changed literally in 20 seconds. I had never talked about it. I had never been involved. I started coaching. I started getting my daughter skating. I started announcing. And more importantly, I started talking about it, which is, by the way, all I do for a living now. So it literally changed every aspect of my life in 20 seconds, all through a conversation.
And again, you seem to have a fascination with brain science. There's biology behind this, right? There's actual sort of neurology behind this in terms
Correct.
of your brain operates in a different way during kairos time than it does in chronos time. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. The brain science, I mean, it's whatever I'm going to tell you is probably wrong. It's just less wrong than last year because there's constant evolution. But what we do know is the brain is writing memories all the time. Some of those are stored, some are not. Some of those are retrievable, some are not. And depending on the context, particularly the emotional context within which you're operating, those memories can be so expansive that a memory that's worth, 2 seconds or 10 seconds of chronological time, chronos, might be worth years of kairos time. For example, that conversation with the boy's father, that kairos moment is probably worth 10 years of my life. I mean, maybe it's worth the rest of my life, because God knows I'd still be slaving away for the man instead of being out on my own talking to people all around the world. So that's the neurology, is you're laying down so much memory that you can actually shift your entire perspective of belief systems, sometimes in as fast as a few seconds.
And so the brain in kairos time is drinking in the experience.
That's right.
What are the triggers for kairos time?
This isn't 100% proven, but my hypothesis is that there's 5. Uniqueness is really important. The amygdala is sitting next to the hippocampus. Hippocampus is sweeping your memories in. The amygdala also can help write memories when there's something unique or often risky. Beauty, I think, often plays a part, at least in the good ones. And then physical intensity sometimes is a part, not always. Emotional intensity is absolutely always a part of these kinds of memories. And then the last is being in the flow state, being in what people in sports call the peak performance state or the zone. When you're doing activities which you're really good at, your brain can process up to 2,000 or 3,000 times faster than in your normal state, and so you can write so much more memory so much faster. It's like a surveillance camera versus an HD camera. You just store so much more, and that's when time expands and life is expansive in its wake.
And my understanding of what you're trying to help people grasp with this is that just like when we were kids and things were unique and beautiful and physical and emotional and in flow, we can actually tune into that as adults and expand our sense of time intentionally. It's
so possible and not even that hard, but it definitely goes against our wiring. We did a survey before this last event I ran, and I asked people what the key triggers were that reminded them when summers were endless, which, by the way, 67% of people say when you ask them how long did summers last as a kid, they say forever. And now they don't, right? So this is the problem we're solving here. And we asked them what key words reminded them of endless summers of youth, and number 1 was water. Water is everywhere. How are we not going to the beach, splashing in the waves, jumping off the rocks, looking for shells? Like, that is not a childlike activity. That is for life. And we just experienced that here when we went down to the beach and went to Cerritos. Like, everybody was back to their childhood, and that couple of hours was expansive. It works. It's easy.
So I'm going to recap this kind of fascinating perspective that you have on life and this way of asking unique questions. Strengths to weaknesses. Are there kind of key rules or key kind of principles that people should be thinking about when they're trying to assess how to double down on their strengths as opposed to their weaknesses?
Yeah, I think there's sort of 2. One is it's hard to know, particularly as kids. It's very hard to know. A weakness and a skill gap looked identical to all children. There's just no way to know if you're good at basketball until you try hard for quite some time. There's no way to know if you're good at English versus math versus physics versus arts until you try hard for quite some time. Mm-hmm. But as adults, at some point, those data points emerge that this comes easier to me, I get more in the flow state, I'm better at this thing, and I'm not so good at this thing. But we're still so wired to go play whack-a-mole with weakness that we spend endless hours and years trying to fix those. And my sort of guiding light there is, as an adult, 2 years is probably the right amount of time to pursue something with full intensity before you make a decision. All right, am I just not good at this? Is it not a strength? Or do I need to change my approach? Maybe I'm going about it wrong, like I did with skating. Or do I just need to quit? Or do I make it a hobby? I mean, it's fine to pursue things you're not good at as long as it's not your lifeblood or your primary relationship. That's what golf is for. The other thing about strengths and weaknesses is that it's really hard for people to let go of this mode. And the easiest way to design around a weakness is to simply admit you have it, which is counter to everything that we are instinctually wanting to do. To say to your boss, I'm actually not that detail-oriented, feels like the death knell. But the reality is, in my career, when I've done exactly that, life immediately got better. And I didn't even get fired. I just got a better job that was more suited to me. Mm-hmm. So if you're spending all of your day playing whack-a-mole with weakness, you're probably either in the wrong job, well, you're probably just in the wrong job.
And I would say as elders, one thing we have in our advantage is knowing some of our strengths
For
and
sure.
some of our weaknesses with greater clarity. And you're saying by communicating those more clearly, we might actually advance better.
I've experienced that over and over again. The day I finally am willing to admit I'm not an aerobic athlete, suddenly life got better. I'm not detail-oriented, suddenly life got a lot better. It's like taking a sandbag off your shoulders. It's like, oh, thank God, finally I can be me.
And then rules for, you call it metabolizing stress, which I absolutely adore. What are your key pointers for people when they're thinking about, okay, so how do I shift both my mindset? Maybe I'm able to gain my understanding of stress, but stress still comes onto us, and you have some principles for the metabolization of stress.
Yeah, for sure. The first step, which most people intuitively know and do regularly, is you got to reduce it sometimes. Like you've got to pull back, regain some ground, get some balance back. If you're completely overstressed and overwhelmed, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for you, and it's not good for your family or your work environment. But that's not where it stops. That's actually where it starts. Once you get to that place, then you need to evaluate whether you're recovering from stress properly. And this is where the corporate athlete is so far away from the Olympic athlete. Olympic athletes do high-intensity stress episodically and then recover. The corporate athletes doing like 15 hours of curls and then wondering why their bicep atrophies. It doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. You have to have recovery, and recovery for adults is these three things, at least the top three, are low-grade physical exercise, not spinning at 250 RPMs, but a long walk, for example, social intimacy, being with the people you love, and physical intimacy, having physical touch with the people you love or pets. It doesn't matter. Fundamentally, that's the number one way we metabolize stress. But here's the thing, everybody gets stressed, and then what do? They stop exercising, they cut off ties with their friends, and they no longer have time for their puppy or their partner because they're so overwhelmed. So our response mechanisms are telling us to do the opposite of what's right for us. So making a firm commitment to these three things, which is, by the way, super easy. Okay, I'll park in the outlet. Okay, I'll have a drink with a friend after work. Okay, I'll spend more time with my partner or my puppy. This is not complicated stuff.
No.
But you have to do it. You have to have the discipline actually to do these things. And then the final step, which we talked about, is how can I look at my world of stressors and threats and view it as a competition, as a game, versus this end-all, be-all. If I get the promotion or I don't, life is at the end. If I get the girl or I don't, oh my God, my life is over. No, I've got a 50% shot at the promotion. I've got a 10% shot at that hot girl. I've got whatever. Like as soon as it's a game, then your response mechanisms, your neurochemicals change, and it works.
And then lastly, rules for Kairos. How might I live in Kairos? And maybe you could close us with a story of one of your recent Kairos experiences or something like that.
So Kairos and Chronos is probably the hardest of the three because we have been hardwired our whole lives to believe that the clock tells the truth about time. And yes, there is a linear oscillating electron or proton, I'm not sure, neuron, I don't know what it is, somewhere in Colorado that's telling us how long time is. But that's only for machines. The way humans experience time is actually a synchronized confederacy of clocks. So you've got your circadian rhythms, you got your mental rhythms, you got your heartbeat, which is why the second is probably what it is. It's probably based on a heartbeat, which is roughly 60 for an adult human male. But it's all arbitrary. These divisions of time are completely arbitrary. And the reality is, as a metaphor, that the universe did more in the first picosecond than in the 13.8 billion years since. So much can happen in a short period of time that if you can't see that the value of an increment of time is not related to its duration, I'll say that once more, the value of an increment of time is not related to its duration. When you believe the lie of Chronos, then you're going to treat each second the same as the last. But if you are with your 3-year-old daughter and she says, I love you, Daddy, don't go, like happened to me when I was consulting, if I had paid attention to that second the same as the one before and the one after, then I wouldn't have quit consulting. But I recognized in that moment that this was a trajectory change. This was a shift. This meant that I needed to make a difference in my life that was meaningful for the next, 14 years and going. So being able to see those trajectory changing moments when they come and act is the heart of kairos. And by the way, kairos is the most common word the Greeks use. In the Bible and all their texts, it's roughly 2/3 of the use. So they basically ignored chronos a vast majority of the time, and we need to learn to do the same thing.
And on that note, I think we should say thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for visiting us here.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Speaking with us, and I know we'll have you back.
Awesome.
John Coyle, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers.